Hey, what's going on, guys? Today I'm going to be making a video, as you guys saw by the thumbnail and the title, obviously, about the difference between Toronto and Vancouver. If you guys don't know me, I'm Max. I lived in Vancouver for almost my whole entire life, and then I moved out to Toronto this last year for 8 months for school, and with that transition, I learned a lot about the difference between the two sides of Canada. If you've grown up in Vancouver, if you've grown up in Toronto, and you haven't been to the other city, then especially if you move there for school or something, you'll see a huge difference, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. The first obvious difference that I'm sure most people know, but I still gotta cover it, is the weather. The weather difference between Vancouver and Toronto is very significant. If you're not used to cold weather, as most Vancouverites aren't, then going to Toronto will be a huge shock for you. In Vancouver, like, your cold winter day is like -5. In Toronto, a cold winter day is like -30. One thing that I also noticed about Toronto is it's always windy, so the wind chill really kills. In Vancouver, we have the occasional windstorm, but it seems like it's a windstorm every single day in Toronto. And the summers there are super hot. Like, Vancouver in general is just very mild, but we get lots of rain. If you're moving from Vancouver to Toronto, be prepared for tons of snow, but no snow days, because their snow removal system is much better than the Vancouver one. So yeah, number one biggest thing, weather, huge difference. Be prepared for that if you're moving to Toronto. Second thing, public transit. In Vancouver, we basically just have like BC TransLink, and that controls all over the lower mainland. C-Bus, the SkyTrain, the buses, everything is TransLink. But in Toronto, one thing that can be kind of confusing when you first move there is that there's multiple different bus companies. It's not all just one company. There's the TTC, which is like the main Toronto transport company, but then there's also like Go Bus and all these other companies that have buses. So when you're on Google Maps or Apple Maps and you try and look up how to bus from one place to another, it might suggest a bus route, but that might include 3 different companies, 4 buses, each having their own fare. I went to Waterloo University once, and it was, I think, $25 to get there and $25 to get back just on buses, just because I was taking different bus companies. Go Bus, you pay a different amount for how far you go, and on the TTC you just pay like a set rate. Make sure if you're a student, you ask for the student rate at any buses, because sometimes they'll give it to you for cheaper. Anything that you're taking from downtown to somewhere or somewhere to downtown is going to be really quick. Okay, number 3, Toronto slang. So if you're from Vancouver and you haven't been to Toronto before and you haven't heard much about it, then you probably won't understand the slang that people speak in Toronto. It's honestly a completely different language, and it took me a really long time to get used to it, but it's really funny. A lot of people in Toronto will constantly speak in the slang, and they're super proud of it. That's another thing that I've noticed about Toronto, is they just seem to be a lot more proud of their city than Vancouver is. Now, Vancouver is a city to be proud of, that's for sure, but I don't find the people in it are super patriotic towards their city, I guess you could say. Now that might have something to do with the sports teams, which leads me to point number 4, which is, if you like sports, Toronto is definitely a great place for you, because they have a basketball team, a hockey team, a soccer team, and a baseball team. So if you're super into baseball or basketball, you'll love going there. The next thing that I want to talk about is pricing. So Toronto is definitely cheaper than Vancouver, especially for housing. Vancouver is ridiculously expensive for housing. But other than that, I think the prices of like food and everything like that is pretty comparable. I think you might have more cheap options in the actual downtown district of Toronto than you would in Vancouver. But for the most part, if you're getting like groceries or if you're just going to a general store, then everything's basically the same. If you are going to school though, I do warn you, buying anything on campus will be more expensive. The next thing I wanted to talk about is just the people in general. Obviously, both Vancouver and Toronto are very ethnically diverse. Everybody in Toronto is decently nice. Now, I have to say, I think people in Vancouver were nicer, and that's not an insult to people in Toronto. Just in general, I think people in Vancouver are very polite. I felt personally safer in Vancouver than I do in Toronto. As a photographer, I'm always walking around town late at night with expensive gear, and I've never had a problem in Vancouver. But in Toronto, I had a few situations where people, I guess you could say, attacked me. One situation in a stairwell where somebody tried to steal my wallet. There was a situation, or 3 situations on the street where some rough looking people came up to me and pushed me around for taking photos. Now I wasn't taking photos of them obviously, but I feel like in Vancouver there's kind of like one part of town where you just wouldn't venture at night on your own. But in Toronto in general, it seems to be pretty spread out, and there's lots of different little places where you shouldn't go, and it's really hard to know that as somebody who hasn't lived there their whole life, so it's hard to avoid those places. But as long as you're around people, like, you should be fine. I just would recommend not going out on your own at night. So that's one big thing that I did notice about Toronto. The next thing I want to talk about is job opportunities, and I think that both Vancouver and Toronto have great opportunities for students and for adults and people of all ages, but I do think Toronto had probably better opportunities. At least when I was looking at like photography jobs and stuff like that, I noticed there's a lot more in Toronto than there was in Vancouver. Definitely if you're a student in Toronto, it will be quite easy for you to find a job, as it would be in Vancouver, but I think especially if you're going to a place like UBC or SFU, those places are kind of their own little city almost, and it'd be hard to find a job directly in that area. But in Toronto, we have things like University of Toronto or Ryerson or these universities. They're literally right in the city center, so it's really easy to get a job that's super close by. So I think that's one really nice thing about going to school in Toronto, is that for the most part the schools are pretty centralized, which makes it easy to commute, makes it easy to get around, makes it easy to go do things. I know I have some friends that go to SFU and go to UBC, and sometimes it can be a challenge for them to get out and do things because there is that inconvenience of being separated from the more downtown district of Vancouver. So that's definitely a plus for Toronto. One other really big thing that I want to address, and that will probably be the last thing I talk about here because it was the most important to me, and this is why I'll still pick Vancouver over Toronto, is just the greenery in Vancouver. While you're living in Vancouver, it's hard to tell how beautiful your city is until you go to another city. And it's not that Toronto's an ugly city, but one thing I really love about Vancouver, and I grew to love about Vancouver while I was in Toronto, was just the green spaces in Vancouver and how they last all year. Vancouver's technically in a rainforest, and it's a lot more of a mild climate than Toronto. So during the winter in Toronto, basically all the plantation, all the trees and everything die, all the leaves fall, and it becomes really gray and gloomy, I found. And that takes up a large percentage of the year too. Like, this is from like November till March. It's all gray, concrete, and dead bushes and trees. And as somebody who likes doing photography and stuff like that, it was kind of gloomy. So that was one thing that I definitely like about Vancouver, is the fact that we have the mountains, we have the trees that last all year long, we have the ocean, we have rivers and streams and everything, and it just seems like a lot more natural and a lot greener and a lot more peaceful. I enjoy going on hikes and things like that, so living in Vancouver is perfect for that. The skiing in Vancouver is way better. If you at all like skiing or snowboarding, then definitely you will like Vancouver better. The skiing in Toronto is terrible and super pricey. I went to Blue Mountain and it was tiny and it was super expensive. I love skiing and I only got to go skiing once my whole time in Toronto, so that was terrible. I didn't like that. But other than that, I think that's about it, guys. I'm gonna wrap the video up here. Thank you guys all for watching. I hope this was informative in some way and you guys could take something away from this. If you guys are moving from Vancouver to Toronto or Toronto to Vancouver, hope this helps you out a little bit. But I'll see you guys later. Peace.